Martha, the farmer's daughter, woke up early every morning to take a walk through the woods before starting her chores. This time, a thick fog blanketed the familiar path, giving it an air of mystery. As she passed by the old oak tree, she noticed something unusual. A man was lying on the ground, unconscious, dressed in expensive yet torn clothes. Martha froze for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. She cautiously stepped closer. "Can you hear me?" she asked, but there was no response. Her heart started pounding faster. She knew she had to act quickly. Without hesitation, Martha ran back to the farm for help. "Dad, there's a man in the woods. He's in bad shape," she exclaimed, and her father, without asking questions, followed her. Together, they carried the man back to their house. He looked out of place in the modest countryside home. His appearance, though disheveled, hinted at wealth. Who was he? Why was he here? All these questions remained unanswered as Martha covered him with a blanket and waited for the doctor to arrive. Martha sat by the bed where the stranger rested. He hadn't regained consciousness yet, but the doctor they had called assured them his condition was stable. Likely exhaustion and a minor head injury. Nothing critical, but he needs rest, the doctor said as he examined the patient. Martha couldn't take her eyes off the man's face. He looked out of place here. Sharp features, a refined appearance, even despite the cuts and bruises. There was something familiar about him, though Martha was certain she had never seen him before. Martha's father watched her from across the room. "He could be anyone, Martha," he said sternly. "We don't know who he is or what his intentions are. We helped him. That's enough. Don't get too involved." Martha nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change their lives. When the stranger finally opened his eyes, his first words were, "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse but firm. "You're on our farm," Martha answered cautiously. "We found you in the woods." The man tried to sit up, but weakness quickly forced him back onto the pillow. "I don't remember," he murmured, staring at the ceiling. Martha and her father exchanged glances when the stranger admitted he couldn't remember anything. "What's your name?" Martha asked cautiously. The man's face tensed as he thought hard, but his gaze remained blank. "I don't know," he whispered. Martha noticed a subtle shudder that ran through him, as if even he was startled by his own answer. Martha's father frowned. "Amnesia? Maybe he's faking," he muttered. But Martha waved him off. "He's exhausted, Dad. This could be real," she replied, watching the man who looked like he was afraid of himself. The stranger tried to sit up again, this time with a little more success. "It's all blurry, like a fog. I remember a car and trees. Then nothing," he said, covering his face with his hands. The next morning, the stranger rose early despite his weakness. He stood by the window, gazing out at the fog rolling over the fields. Martha brought him a simple breakfast, a bowl of oatmeal and a slice of bread. "Are you really feeling better?" she asked, trying to hide her concern. "Yes, thank you. You're very kind," the man replied, sitting down slowly. His movements were deliberate, but there was determination in them. "My dad says if you're staying here, you need to help out," Martha said with a smile. The man nodded. "I'm ready. I don't know who I am, but I feel like I need to work to repay your kindness." Martha led him to the barn, where her father was already hard at work. "Here, find him something to do," she said, leaving them alone. Her father eyed the stranger critically. "I can see you're not used to hard labor, but we'll see what you're capable of." The man silently picked up a shovel and got to work. His hands quickly blistered, but he didn't complain. Hours later, Martha's father approached her. "He's got endurance. Maybe he's not so bad after all," he muttered, though he tried not to show approval. Meanwhile, Martha started noticing that her guest behaved differently from ordinary people. His manners were refined, and he occasionally used words that didn't fit the speech of a simple man. But who was he really? That question continued to haunt her. Days passed, and the stranger gradually adapted to the rhythm of life on the farm. He worked in the fields, repaired fences, and helped with chores, though it was clear that physical labor didn't come easily to him. His efforts, however, began to earn the respect of even Martha's father, who had been wary at first. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, Martha couldn't hold back her curiosity any longer. "Do you remember anything? A name, a place, anything?" she asked. The man thought for a moment, his gaze distant. Just fragments, a car, a road, and a man, but nothing specific. "Maybe I'm just afraid to remember," he said quietly. An uneasy silence fell over the table. Later that night, Martha decided to check on him. She brought him some warm tea and a blanket to help ward off the cool evening air. "You don't have to tell me anything, but just know we're here to help," she said, sitting beside him. "Thank you, Martha," he replied. "You've done more for me than I could have ever expected. But sometimes I feel like my past might bring you trouble." His words surprised her. "What do you mean?" she asked. The man simply shook his head. "I'm not sure, but I have a feeling there's something dangerous in my past." The next morning, Martha began noticing strange things. On the edge of the field, she spotted tire tracks that hadn't been there before. Someone had driven near the farm, even though the road was used only by locals. In the evening, as Martha was feeding the chickens, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She turned around, but there was no one in sight. "Maybe it's just fatigue," she thought, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Meanwhile, the stranger, whom they had jokingly started calling John to give him a name, began displaying unusual skills. One day, he calmed a panicked animal caught in the fence with just a few gentle words. Martha noticed this and was surprised. "John, where did you learn to do that?" she asked, watching him expertly tie a knot in the rope as though it came naturally to him. John shrugged. "I don't know. It just happens," he replied, though it was clear even he was puzzled by his abilities. That night, Martha heard a muffled noise outside her window. She looked out and saw headlights in the distance, quickly disappearing into the darkness. Alarmed, she went to wake her father. "Someone's snooping around the farm," she said. Her father frowned. "Maybe it's no coincidence. Stay close to the house and keep an eye out." Martha couldn't sleep until dawn, feeling certain that something serious was on its way. That day, the tension around the farm grew thicker. Martha's father, noticing the approaching danger, ordered her to be cautious. "We need to be prepared for anything," he said sternly. Martha went into the woods to check the surrounding area, but as soon as she walked a few hundred meters, her heart began to race. She saw strange tracks on the ground, leading clearly toward the forest, whether from people or vehicles, she couldn't tell. Martha felt this was no coincidence. Returning home, she told her father about the discovery, but he didn't seem surprised. "I told you, Martha, it might be related to your guest," he said, pointing to John, who was working in the field at that very moment. "You think he's hiding something?" Martha asked, though she didn't want to believe it. "I don't know, but if he's not telling us the truth, we can't be sure he won't bring us trouble," her father replied. Martha looked at John, who was approaching the house. His gaze was focused, and his face wore a look of melancholy. No matter how hard she tried, her sense of unease was growing heavier. John seemed more and more like a mystery she couldn't solve. At that moment, a car pulled up to the farm. It felt like something had shifted. The sense of danger was becoming more and more palpable. The car that pulled up to the farm was black and new. It had no license plates, and that immediately caught Martha's attention. She stood in the hallway, looking out the window, when the door opened and a man stepped into the yard. His face was familiar, but Martha couldn't recall where she had seen him before. The man approached John, who was standing in the field with a hoe in his hands. From their conversation, it was clear they knew each other, though John tried to hide any emotion. Martha felt her heart start racing as the man drew closer. Martha stood in the shadows, trying not to attract attention. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the tension in their glances. A few minutes later, the man approached Martha. "You're Martha?" he asked, his voice familiar. Martha was startled. "Yes, and you are?" she asked, trying to hide the unease in her voice. The man smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "I'm Alexander. Don't you remember me?" Martha felt a chill run down her spine. This was impossible. She didn't know anyone named Alexander, but there was something in his gaze that made her uneasy. Martha nodded, pretending everything was fine. "No, sorry. I don't remember," she replied. Alexander remained silent for a few seconds, then added, "No matter. I'm here to speak with your guest." Martha felt her heart sink into her stomach. Who was this man, and why did he want to speak with John? Alexander stood in the yard, his gaze sharp and cold, watching Martha. She felt the air around her grow heavy. "Sorry, but I don't understand why you want to speak with my guest," Martha asked, trying to keep her voice steady, even though fear and confusion swirled inside her. Alexander turned away and looked at John, who was standing nearby, watching them both. "I have serious business with him," he replied, his tone distant. Martha felt lost. What did this man want from John? She couldn't understand why he had come, and why their conversation felt so tense. Could this Alexander be a part of John's past? Flustered, she decided to approach John. "Do you know this man?" she asked, trying to stay calm. John glanced at Alexander, his expression serious. "Yes, I know him," he answered, but there was a hint of unease in his voice. Alexander suddenly addressed him. "It's time to talk, John. This can't go on any longer." Martha looked at John in shock. His face had become impassive, like he had turned into a different person when he saw this man. "What does this mean?" Martha asked, her heart racing. She felt as though everything around her was spinning, and it had to be something important. John was silent for a moment, then sighed as if making a decision. "All right, we'll talk," he said, and without looking back at Martha, he walked toward the house. Martha stood there, not knowing what to think. She looked at Alexander, but couldn't read anything in his eyes. What was the connection between them? What secret was he hiding? Martha remained in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. Her heart raced, and each step John took toward the house seemed slow and heavy. She couldn't ignore it any longer. What was this conversation between them? Why had Alexander insisted so firmly on this meeting? She knew she had to find out more, but what should she do next? Martha decided to follow them, trying not to be noticed. She moved carefully, like a shadow, trailing them toward the house. Her steps were quiet, but her heart pounded loudly in her chest. When she reached the door, she could hear voices. John and Alexander were talking in another room, but it was still quiet enough for Martha to make out parts of their conversation. "It has to stay between us, Alexander," John said, his voice hard. "You know what this could lead to if I reveal this." Alexander replied coldly, "You don't have a choice, John. It can't be hidden any longer. She has to know the truth." Martha flinched when she heard this. Who needed to know the truth? What truth had they been hiding for so long? She couldn't let it go unanswered. Deciding that now was the time, she took a step forward and quietly opened the door. Her heart pounded faster as she saw the two men standing together, exchanging looks that said more than words ever could. "I have a right to know what's going on," Martha said, stepping into the room. "What are you hiding from me?" John and Alexander froze. They exchanged glances, and in their eyes was the same sad truth they had feared to show her. "Martha," John started but couldn't finish his sentence. Alexander interrupted, speaking to her with a new tone. "She has to know. This is her life too," he said, looking at John. Martha stood there, not understanding why it was so hard to get to the truth. Was it too late? Martha stood in front of John and Alexander, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind overwhelmed with questions. She couldn't believe her ears. Was it really true? John, a simple farmer, was actually a millionaire? John sighed heavily and glanced at Alexander, who was standing by the window, looking calm and confident. Then he turned to Martha and, for what seemed like the first time, looked at her as if he meant it. Martha, I have to tell you something important, he began, his voice quiet and hesitant. You have the right to know the truth. Martha watched him with growing anxiety. I have the right to the truth? Then why haven't you told me sooner? Her voice grew stronger, though she tried to keep calm. John paused, as if searching for the right words. Then it seemed he made a choice and decided to say the hardest thing. I'm not who I seem to be. I'm a millionaire. And Alexander, he's here for a reason. He represents my inheritance, he said, looking her straight in the eye. Martha couldn't believe what she was hearing. All these years, she had thought of John as a simple farmer who worked hard alongside his family. And now, this shocking truth. Is this some kind of joke? She asked, her voice sounding nervous. No, it's not a joke, Alexander answered, stepping closer. Your father, John, was the owner of a huge corporation, owning real estate, businesses, and assets around the world. It all belongs to you, and you have the right to it. Martha couldn't hold it in any longer. But why did you tell me this earlier? She asked John, letting all her emotions spill into one question. Why did you hide this from me? John looked at her with pain in his eyes. I didn't want you to love me just for my money. I was afraid that, once you knew the truth, you'd change the way you looked at me, he replied, his voice breaking a little. Martha stepped back a few paces, trying to make sense of everything she had just heard. Her thoughts were a jumble, and she couldn't figure out how to feel about it all. Alexander stepped closer to her and said, This isn't everything. Your family isn't simple, and you have the right to know more. But this is no longer just about business. It's about your life. Martha stayed silent. But one thought rang through her mind. How would this truth change everything she had known? Martha felt the sharp sting of disappointment in her chest. All these months, all these days, when she had been by John's side, when he seemed so simple, so genuine, and now, all of it shattered in an instant. How could he hide such an important part of his life? How could he deceive her, not give her a chance to understand who he truly was? Unable to bear it anymore, Martha quickly turned and ran out of the room. No words, no explanations, just ran. She made her way through the yard, passing trees and bushes, trying to escape her thoughts, escape this truth that felt so unbearable. She couldn't stay here any longer. The forest was her refuge, her place of escape. Among the trees, she could find some silence, some peace, trying to gather her thoughts, to figure out what to do next. The wind rustled through the branches, but Martha didn't stop. She ran deeper into the forest, hiding from the world, from the people who kept taking her peace away. She needed to be alone with herself. Her mind was overflowing with questions and her heart with bitterness. But she didn't expect him to come. She didn't hear his footsteps, but she felt him draw near. And suddenly, feeling the warm air beside her, she saw his figure. Martha, John called out, his voice a bit hoarse but filled with determination. He stood at the edge of the forest, his whole posture showing a struggle between his feelings and the things he had done. Martha turned to him but said nothing. There was bitterness in her eyes, pain in her heart. She felt betrayed and deceived, and despite everything, she didn't know if she was ready to forgive him. I couldn't tell you earlier, he sighed, taking a step forward. I was afraid you wouldn't understand, that you'd run away from me. Martha stood still, looking at him. She could feel her heart breaking, but she couldn't find the words. She saw the genuine pain and remorse in his eyes, but it didn't erase the months of lies. I know you didn't want to hear this, he continued, his voice deepening, becoming more serious. But you need to know one thing, Martha. He stepped closer. I don't want to be rich through your eyes. I want to be with you because I love you. Martha took another step back. She couldn't forgive him right now. Her soul was torn. She wanted to believe him, but she couldn't. Maybe I still don't know you, John, she said quietly, glancing at the forest that beckoned her with its silence and calm. She turned back to the forest, to leave this place, to leave John. All these feelings, all these emotions were too much to handle, and she felt that the best thing to do was to run away. Time passed, but John couldn't find peace. He had gone to the city, trying to leave it all behind, hoping that time and distance would help him forget Martha. But every time he closed his eyes, she was there, her image, her words, the way she looked at him with those eyes full of sadness and questions. Each day he woke up with a heavy heart, as though he had lost something he couldn't get back. It was hard to go back to his usual life because he couldn't bring himself to forget her. John realized that he wanted to be with her, and despite everything that had happened, his feelings hadn't faded. On the contrary, they had only grown stronger. After a few weeks, he couldn't take it anymore. John decided to return to her. He didn't know if she would forgive him, if she would agree to talk to him, but he was ready for whatever the outcome would be. He had to see her at least one last time. When John arrived at her house, his heart was racing so fast that he could hear each step echoing loudly in his ears. He didn't know what to say, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave this without talking. Martha was sitting on the bench outside, looking at the sky. She was alone, but she looked calm, though John could see her eyes were clouded with thoughts, as if she was trying to find answers to her questions. She wasn't surprised when she saw him, just took a deep breath and looked at him in silence. Martha, his voice was soft but clear, and he took a step forward. I came back to talk to you again. I know I've messed up, but I want you to understand that I love you. I can't live without you. Martha looked up, her face unreadable, but there was a struggle in her eyes. She wondered if she was ready to hear those words again, if she was willing to give him another chance. John, she said quietly, sighing, you left, and you didn't come back when I needed you the most. Why are you here now? John stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. I couldn't forget you, Martha. I realize I made a mistake, but I'm ready to make it right. I don't want to hide the truth from you anymore. I don't want to lose you. Martha felt her heart start to race, but she wasn't ready for such a turn of events. All of these emotions overwhelmed her. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but staying in the shadows was no longer an option. I don't know what to do with these feelings, John, she replied, lowering her head. You made me doubt you, and I don't know if I can trust you again. But in his eyes was such pain, such sincerity, that Martha began to hesitate. Maybe she could give him a chance. Maybe it wasn't too late. John sat beside Martha on the bench, his gaze intense and piercing, his voice full of desperation and hope. He didn't care how difficult it was to speak, because he knew this was his last chance, and if he didn't find the right words, he might lose her forever. Martha, I can't live without you anymore. His voice was soft but firm. I can't forget the day you left, and every moment without you feels like endless pain. Martha sat silently, her face hidden in the shade of her hair, and she twisted a small stone in her hands, as if seeking support from something ordinary. She was trying to gather her thoughts, to understand what she truly felt. Why did you leave? She finally asked, looking up at him. Her voice was calm, but there was pain in it. Why did you come back when I needed you? Why did you hide all of this from me? John sighed deeply, feeling his heart tighten with pain. I was weak, Martha, he replied, not breaking eye contact. I was afraid I'd lose you because of my mistake. I was scared that if you found out the truth, you'd think I was deceitful or a liar. I just didn't know how to be with you. You were a stranger to me when I found out you were a millionaire, she responded, her eyes looking sad and heavy. I couldn't understand why you hadn't shared that with me earlier. Why did you hide your true self from me? I was afraid you'd be with me not for who I am, but for what I have, John said, his voice becoming even softer. I didn't want you to love me because of my money. I wanted you to love me for me. That's why I stayed silent. But I realize now that was my biggest mistake. Martha remained silent, her heart racing. It was hard for her to forgive, but she could feel the sincerity in his words that she couldn't ignore. "I love you so much, Martha," John said, moving closer to her. "I want you to be mine, even if I have to show you who I really am. I'm ready to open up to you, even if it means you'll walk away from me. I love you more than anything in this world, and I want you to believe me." Martha lifted her gaze and looked at him. Her heart was overflowing with emotions, and she could no longer pretend she didn't hear his words. She took a deep breath and clenched her hands on her knees. "Do you really want this?" she asked, her voice on the verge of tears. "Are you ready to give me the chance I deserve?" John placed his hand on hers, and they looked into each other's eyes, where there was not only pain and sadness, but also hope. He didn't answer with words, but his gaze was clear. Yes! He was ready. They sat there for a while in silence, believing in the possibility of starting over, hoping that their feelings could truly be strong, despite all the hardships they had endured. The day arrived bright and cold, just like their feelings, outlined between doubts and hope. John and Martha sat on the same bench in the forest where everything had begun, but now it felt different. The silence around them was almost enchanted, stretching for hours, but both felt the importance of this moment. John tried to articulate his thoughts, but even his words couldn't convey everything happening in his soul. He saw something deeper in Martha's eyes. More than just a lingering distance, he saw hope. "Martha," he said softly, not breaking his gaze from her trembling lips. "We can't start over unless I explain how I feel. You're not just a part of my life. You are everything. I'm ready to leave everything behind to be with you. No more secrets. No more lies. I want you to see that I'm not just a millionaire with a bank account. I'm the John you first met." Martha listened, trying to find answers to her questions. Her heart raced faster than it ever had when standing on the edge of a life-changing decision. "You're right," she said, lifting her gaze, and in her eyes there was not only pain but readiness for a new beginning. "But why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did I have to find out this way?" John sighed deeply, remembering the moment when he felt everything slipping away, when he almost lost her. "I was afraid, Martha," he replied, never breaking eye contact. "Afraid I'd lose you because of my mistake. I was scared that if you found out the truth, you'd think I was deceitful or a liar. I just didn't know how to be with you. You were a stranger to me when I found out you were a millionaire," she responded, her eyes looking heavy and sad. "I couldn't understand why you hadn't shared that with me earlier. Why did you hide your true self from me? I was afraid you'd be with me, not for who I am, but for what I have," John said, his voice even softer. "I didn't want you to love me because of my money. I wanted you to love me for me. That's why I stayed silent. But now I realize that was my biggest mistake." Martha stayed silent, her heart pounding faster. It was hard for her to forgive, but she could feel the sincerity in his words she couldn't ignore. "I love you so much, Martha," John said, moving closer to her. "I want you to be mine, even if I have to show you who I really am. I'm ready to open up to you, even if it means you'll walk away from me. I love you more than anything in this world, and I want you to believe me." Martha lifted her gaze and looked at him. Her heart was overflowing with emotions, and she could no longer pretend she didn't hear his words. She took a deep breath and clenched her hands on her knees. "Do you really want this?" she asked, her voice on the verge of tears. "Are you ready to give me the chance I deserve?" John placed his hand on hers, and they looked into each other's eyes, where there was not only pain and sadness, but also hope. He didn't answer with words, but his gaze was clear. Yes! He was ready. They sat there for a while in silence, believing in the possibility of starting over, hoping that their feelings could truly be strong, despite all the hardships they had endured. Several months had passed since John and Martha found each other again. During this time, they had been building their relationship on new, solid foundations of trust and openness. Each day felt like a small step toward becoming closer, stronger. And even when difficulties arose, they always found their way back to each other. Their life had gradually returned to normal. They spent evenings together, cooked dinners, laughed, and talked about the future. A future with no place for doubts or unsaid words. Martha realized that her heart no longer belonged to the past, and she could no longer pull away from John. The love they shared felt warm, like an embrace, and as steady as a night sky. They were no longer just together, they were one, and Martha felt it at every step. But John, though happy, hadn't said the most important thing yet. He had been waiting for the moment that would define everything, and that moment had arrived. That morning, everything was as usual. John and Martha woke up, had breakfast together, discussing plans for the day. But John was so focused on his goal that he didn't even notice how his hand trembled as he placed the cup on the table. Martha noticed his unusual behavior and raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone light, almost carefree, though she couldn't ignore how his gaze became more serious. John hesitated for a few seconds. He wiped his hands with a napkin, and then, in his eyes, a newfound determination appeared. "Martha," he began. His voice was a bit shaky but confident. She felt her heart start to race faster when he paused, then stood up and walked toward her. In his hands was a small black box. Nothing ordinary about it. This was the moment that would change their lives forever. "I want you to know that everything I promised, to be with you not for money or status, but for my feelings. I want to give you what you deserve. All my love and devotion." Martha stared at him, her heart still for a few seconds. She could feel him becoming closer. It seemed like he was ready to open himself fully to her, without holding back. But this wasn't enough. She noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he opened the box, revealing the most beautiful diamond ring she had ever seen, resting on a golden band. "Martha, I love you, and I'm ready to be with you forever. Will you marry me?" His voice was low and calm, but there was an undeniable depth to it. Martha couldn't believe her eyes. This was more than she had ever imagined. Her thoughts spun wildly in her mind, but they all converged into one. She couldn't believe this moment had finally arrived. She looked at John, and as she saw him, it felt like all the doubts and hardships had already been left behind. "Yes, John, yes." Her words burst out of her chest, and in that moment, her eyes filled with tears. Tears of joy, knowing that everything she had dreamed of was now a reality. She was ready to spend the rest of her life with him. John, seeing her reaction, sighed in relief and immediately slid the ring onto her finger. When it happened, he felt all his doubts and fears leave him, like wind carrying away the unnecessary. They were one now. They embraced, and at that moment, they embraced, and the entire world seemed to stand still. All the words faded away, and only the beating of their hearts in unison reminded them of this moment. John held Martha as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and he couldn't imagine life without her. For him, this was more than a simple question. It was a promise to be with her forever, to support her, love her, and care for her, even when storms appeared on the horizon. Martha pressed closer to him, her face hidden in his shoulder, but she didn't need anything more. She felt how all her fears, doubts, and indecisiveness left her, and with each touch from him, she returned to herself, to him, to the world they were building together. "I love you, John," she whispered, lifting her head and looking him in the eyes. Her voice was soft but so certain. These were words she had wanted to say for so long, but they carried a special weight in this moment. "I love you too, Martha," John replied, his eyes filled with tenderness. "And I promise to make you happy." These words, so simple to say, were so incredibly important for both of them. They already knew there was no room for doubt or fear anymore. This was their story, and they were ready to write it together, regardless of the obstacles. All the past difficulties, all the disappointments, all the moments of uncertainty were left behind like old books that no longer needed to be read. Now, they were starting a new chapter. Over the next few days, John and Martha felt like they were living in a fairy tale. They celebrated their engagement surrounded by their closest friends and family. All the anxiety had vanished, and their life was slowly returning to a new normal. Now they were together and always would be. But just when everything seemed to fall into place, Martha realized there was one more important thing she needed to address. She had stayed on the farm, and although her heart belonged to John, she was still tied to the place that had become her home. Martha loved this land, this farm, all the years of hard work she had spent here with her father. Her heart was torn between the new life she was building with John and the place that had always been her home. One day, as the sun set behind the horizon, Martha decided to step outside to catch her breath. She sat on the old bench near the house and closed her eyes, letting the scent of fresh grass and trees fill her soul. In that moment, she felt both detached and grateful. She knew her heart could no longer be torn. She was no longer alone. She was with John. But the one thing she couldn't forget was her father. He was no longer there, and while John had always supported her, she still felt this pull. The pull to stand on the land again, to care for it like her father once did. "Martha, are you here?" John's voice called out. He approached and sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Her gaze shifted, and she realized this was a moment when they would make their decision together. "I think it's time to move forward," she said. Her voice was calm, but filled with resolve. "We'll be together, but I want to do it right. I want to open a new page." John looked at her carefully, his face serious. He understood exactly what she was talking about. Martha didn't want to leave her past behind, but she was ready to give it new meaning. John gently took her hand. "I'm ready for this," he said, looking at her with deep understanding. "We'll do it together." Her eyes filled with tears, and Martha knew she no longer needed to fear anything. She could live here on this land and with John build a new life, leaving behind everything that no longer served them. And so began a new phase in their life. John and Martha decided that their future wasn't just a farm or the city. It was everything they were building together. They combined everything: her love for this land and his drive for big changes. They started a new chapter, one that was more exciting than any previous one, because now they were together and ready for anything. But more than anything, Martha felt this in the moment when John didn't just ask about their future. He gave her the future, a future where they would face every challenge together, and where the most important thing was that they were for each other. The next day, John and Martha sat down together, planning their future farm. They decided to renovate the old buildings, grow new crops, and create a small garden. It was their joint project, a small farm where they could start anew. And it was at that moment, as they sat together at the table, drawing up plans for the future, that Martha knew this was the moment when everything changed. They were writing their story again, and this story was theirs. It was real. It was uncompromising, and they were ready to go through everything together. They had found their harmony, and now their hearts belonged only to each other. All those weeks, all those trials, they were just the beginning. And ahead, despite all obstacles, they moved forward together, toward a bright new future that awaited them.